I discovered my identical twin had been living my life, so I decided to live his. It was better. The morning started like any other Tuesday until I walked into my usual coffee shop, and the barista handed me a drink I'd never ordered before. She smiled and said my order was ready, mentioning something about how I'd been coming in every day for the past month, asking for the same complicated latte with oat milk and extra foam. I don't drink oat milk, never have, but I took the drink anyway because arguing seemed pointless and I was already running late for work. On the subway, three different people nodded at me like they knew me well, including this older woman who squeezed my shoulder and asked how the situation with my landlord was working out. I had no idea what she was talking about, but I mumbled something about it being better now and she looked relieved. The whole ride felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's movie where everyone knew the script except me. At work, my supervisor called me into her office and thanked me for staying late the previous Friday to finish the quarterly reports. The problem was, I'd left early that Friday to go to my cousin's birthday party, and I definitely hadn't touched any quarterly reports. When I tried to explain this, she looked at me confused and pulled up my computer login records showing I'd been there until almost midnight. The timestamps were right there on the screen, but I knew for certain I hadn't been anywhere near the office that night. During lunch break, I decided to walk around the block to clear my head, but everywhere I went, people seemed to recognize me. The guy at the deli asked if I wanted my usual sandwich, which apparently was turkey and Swiss on rye with mustard, not the ham and cheese I actually preferred. A woman walking her dog waved enthusiastically and shouted something about how great it was that I'd finally started jogging in the mornings. I hate jogging, always have, but she seemed so genuinely happy to see me that I just waved back. The weirdest part happened when I got home to my apartment building, and Mrs. Chen from down the hall stopped me in the lobby. She thanked me profusely for helping her move her furniture last weekend, and said her back was feeling much better thanks to my advice about proper lifting techniques. I'd spent last weekend binge-watching movies in my pajamas, definitely not helping anyone move furniture or giving medical advice about backs. That evening, I sat in my apartment trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I started making a list of all the strange interactions, and a terrifying pattern began to emerge. Someone who looked exactly like me was living parts of my life, going to my coffee shop, interacting with my neighbors, and apparently even doing work at my office. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I had a doppelganger running around the city. I decided to test my theory by going back to the coffee shop the next morning at a different time than usual. I arrived an hour earlier than normal and positioned myself across the street where I could watch the entrance. Sure enough, at exactly the time I usually showed up, I saw myself walk into the coffee shop. Not someone who looked like me, but literally me, wearing clothes from my closet that I remembered buying, walking with my exact gait, even carrying the same messenger bag I'd been using for years. My heart was pounding as I watched this other version of myself order the oat milk latte and chat casually with the barista like they were old friends. He seemed completely at ease, comfortable in a way that I never felt in social situations. When he left the shop, I followed him from a distance, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice me but close enough to see where he was going. He walked to a subway station I'd never used before and took a train heading in the opposite direction from where I worked. I managed to get on the same car without him seeing me, hiding behind a newspaper while watching him scroll through his phone. He seemed relaxed, almost content, occasionally smiling at something on his screen in a way that made me jealous of his apparent happiness. When he got off at a stop in a neighborhood I'd never visited, I followed him up the stairs and onto a tree-lined street filled with brownstones and small cafes. He walked with purpose, clearly familiar with the area, and stopped in front of a building that looked like it had been converted into apartments. I watched from behind a parked car as he used a key to let himself in, and I realized this other version of me had his own place, his own life, completely separate from mine. I spent the rest of the day walking around that neighborhood, trying to piece together what kind of life this other me was living. I went into a few shops and cafes, and sure enough, several people recognized me and made small talk about things I had no memory of. A bookstore owner asked about the novel I was supposedly writing, and a woman at a bakery mentioned how much she'd enjoyed our conversation about sustainable gardening the previous week. The next few days became an obsessive routine of following this other version of myself around the city. I discovered he had a completely different schedule than mine, visiting places I'd never been, talking to people I'd never met, and seemingly living a much more interesting and fulfilling life than I was. He went to art galleries, attended book readings, volunteered at a community garden, and generally seemed to be the person I'd always wished I could be but never had the courage to become. What really struck me was how confident he appeared in every situation. While I spent most of my time feeling anxious and uncertain, this other me moved through the world with a sense of purpose and belonging that I envied deeply. He made eye contact with strangers, struck up conversations with ease, and seemed genuinely interested in the people around him. Watching him was like seeing a better version of myself, one who had somehow figured out how to be happy. After a week of surveillance, I decided I needed to confront him directly. I waited outside his apartment building early one morning, my heart racing as I prepared for what might be the strangest conversation of my life. When he emerged from the building, I stepped out from behind the tree where I'd been hiding and called out to him. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me, and for a moment we just stared at each other in complete shock. The resemblance was perfect, down to the small scar on his left eyebrow that I'd gotten falling off my bike as a kid. We had the same eyes, the same nose, the same slightly crooked smile, but there was something different about his expression. He looked surprised but not afraid, curious rather than defensive, and when he spoke, his voice was exactly mine but somehow warmer, more confident. He suggested we go to a nearby diner to talk, and as we walked there together, I felt like I was in some kind of bizarre dream. People on the street did double takes, clearly confused by seeing two identical men walking side by side, but my other self seemed unbothered by the attention. He ordered coffee and pancakes while I stuck with just coffee, too nervous to eat anything. What he told me over the next hour changed everything I thought I knew about reality. He explained that he'd been aware of me for months, watching me live what he called a half-life, going through the motions of existence without really engaging with the world around me. He'd started gradually inserting himself into my routine, not to steal my life, but to show me what it could be like if I made different choices. He wasn't trying to replace me or take over my identity, he said. Instead, he'd been hoping I would eventually notice the changes and start asking questions. His plan was to gradually demonstrate that life could be more fulfilling, more connected, more meaningful than the isolated existence I'd been living. He'd been leaving breadcrumbs, hoping I would follow them and discover there was a different way to be in the world. The most shocking revelation was that he wasn't some supernatural duplicate or long-lost twin. He was me, or rather, he was the version of me that existed in the spaces between my conscious moments, the person I could be when I wasn't held back by fear and self-doubt. He'd somehow found a way to manifest independently, to live the life I was too scared to pursue, and he'd been trying to show me that it was possible. He offered to teach me how to access this other way of being, to help me understand that the confident, engaged person I'd been watching wasn't a separate entity, but a part of myself that I'd been suppressing. It wasn't about him taking over my life or me taking over his, but about integrating these different aspects of who I was into a more complete version of myself. The process wasn't easy or immediate. Over the following weeks, we spent hours together, and he showed me how to approach situations with curiosity instead of anxiety, how to engage with people authentically instead of hiding behind politeness, and how to pursue interests and passions I'd always been too scared to explore. He taught me that the difference between his life and mine wasn't about circumstances or opportunities, but about the choices we made moment by moment. I started spending time in his neighborhood, getting to know the people who had become part of his social circle. They welcomed me warmly, and I realized that the connections he'd built weren't based on some magical charisma I lacked, but on genuine interest in others and a willingness to be vulnerable and authentic. The bookstore owner really did want to hear about creative projects. The bakery woman genuinely enjoyed conversations about gardening, and the barista at the coffee shop was just happy to have regular customers who treated her like a human being. Gradually, I began to understand that what I'd been calling his life was actually the life I'd been capable of living all along. The volunteering, the art galleries, the book readings, the conversations with neighbors, none of these required special skills or talents I didn't possess. They just required showing up, being present, and choosing engagement over isolation. The most profound change happened when I started applying his approach to my regular job and routine. Instead of going through the motions at work, I began actually contributing to projects, offering ideas and building relationships with my colleagues. Instead of rushing through my commute with headphones on, I started noticing the people around me and sometimes even striking up conversations. My supervisor noticed the difference immediately and started giving me more interesting assignments. My neighbors became actual neighbors instead of just people I nodded at in the hallway. Even simple activities like grocery shopping became more enjoyable when I approached them with curiosity and openness, instead of just trying to get through them as quickly as possible. The strangest part was that as I began to embody more of what I'd learned from watching my other self, he started to fade. Not dramatically or suddenly, but gradually, like he was being absorbed back into me. Our meetings became less frequent, and when we did spend time together, the distinction between us became harder to maintain. It was as if the gap between who I was and who I could be was closing. The final time I saw him was about 2 months after our first conversation in the diner. We met at the community garden where he'd been volunteering, and as we worked together planting vegetables for the fall harvest, I realized I could barely tell the difference between his movements and mine. When I looked up from the soil, he was smiling at me with an expression of pride and satisfaction. He told me that his work was essentially done, that I'd learned what I needed to learn and had begun living the life he'd been trying to show me was possible. He said that from now on, the choices would be mine to make, and that I had everything I needed to continue growing and connecting and engaging with the world around me. As the sun set over the garden, I felt him become part of me in a way that was both strange and completely natural. It wasn't like he disappeared, but more like he dissolved into the person I was becoming, the person I'd always had the potential to be. I understood then that he hadn't been a separate entity at all, but a manifestation of my own unexpressed possibilities. Walking home that evening, I stopped at the coffee shop and ordered the oat milk latte I'd never tried before. It was actually pretty good, and I found myself chatting with the barista about her day, asking questions I was genuinely curious about rather than just making polite conversation. She seemed surprised but pleased by my interest, and I realized this was how simple it could be to connect with people. That night, I called my cousin and apologized for leaving her birthday party early a few months ago. We ended up talking for over an hour, and she mentioned how nice it was to have a real conversation with me instead of the usual surface-level check-ins. I told her about some of the changes I'd been making in my life, and she said she'd noticed something different in my voice, something more present and engaged. Over the following months, I continued to build on what I'd learned from my other self. I started taking evening classes in photography, something I'd always been interested in but never pursued. I joined a hiking group that met on weekends, and through them, I discovered a love for being outdoors that I'd never known I had. I even started writing in a journal, not because I thought I had anything profound to say, but because I found I enjoyed the process of putting my thoughts and experiences into words. The most significant change was in how I approached relationships. Instead of waiting for other people to reach out or include me, I started being the one who suggested plans, who checked in on friends, who remembered important events in their lives. I discovered that most people are actually eager to connect and share experiences, but someone has to take the first step. My apartment, which had always felt like a place to hide from the world, became a place I enjoyed spending time in and sharing with others. I started inviting people over for dinner, hosting game nights, and generally treating my home as a space for connection rather than isolation. The same physical space felt completely different when I approached it with a different mindset. Work became more fulfilling as I stopped thinking of it as something I had to endure and started seeing it as an opportunity to contribute something meaningful. I began volunteering for projects that interested me, offering to help colleagues with challenges they were facing, and generally approaching my job as a chance to be useful and engaged rather than just collecting a paycheck. The neighborhood where my other self had lived became a regular part of my routine, but now I was creating my own relationships and experiences there rather than just observing his. I became a regular at the bookstore, actually did start writing a novel, and joined the community garden as a volunteer. These weren't his activities anymore, they were mine, chosen because they brought me joy and connection. Looking back now, I realized that the person I thought was living my life was actually showing me how to live my own life more fully. The confident, engaged, happy person I'd been watching wasn't a stranger or a duplicate, but a version of myself that had been waiting for me to choose to become him. The real transformation wasn't about switching lives with someone else, but about finally deciding to fully inhabit my own life. The experience taught me that we all have the capacity to be more than we think we are, to connect more deeply, to engage more fully, and to find more meaning in our daily experiences. The difference between a life that feels empty and one that feels fulfilling isn't about changing our circumstances, but about changing how we show up in the circumstances we have. I still think about that other version of myself sometimes, but now I understand that he was never really other at all. He was just me, living with intention and presence and courage, showing me that it was possible to be the person I'd always wanted to be but never believed I could become. The life I thought was better than mine wasn't actually different from mine at all. It was just lived with more awareness, more connection, and more willingness to be vulnerable and authentic. These days, when I walk through the city, I notice how many people seem to be sleepwalking through their lives the way I used to, going through the motions without really engaging. I want to tell them that there's another way, that they already have everything they need to live more fully. But I know that everyone has to discover this for themselves. You can't force someone to wake up to their own possibilities, they have to choose to see them. The coffee shop where this whole journey began is still part of my morning routine. But now I'm the regular customer who knows the barista's name and asks about her weekend plans. I order different drinks depending on my mood, sometimes the oat milk latte, sometimes something completely different. The choice feels meaningful now in a way it never did before, a small but significant expression of who I'm choosing to be in each moment. My life isn't perfect, and I still have moments of doubt and anxiety, but I approach them differently now. Instead of retreating into isolation when things get difficult, I reach out to friends, engage with my community, and remember that connection and growth are always possible. The person I used to be feels like a distant memory, someone who was so focused on protecting himself from disappointment that he forgot to actually live. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never noticed the changes, if I'd never followed that other version of myself and discovered what was possible. I might have continued going through the motions indefinitely, never realizing that a richer, more connected life was always within my reach. The thought makes me grateful for whatever force in the universe decided to wake me up to my own potential. The story doesn't have a dramatic ending because it's not really a story with an ending at all. It's more like a beginning, the start of a life lived with more intention and presence and courage than I ever thought possible. Every day I get to choose whether to be the person I used to be or the person I discovered I could become. And most days, I choose to be more fully myself than I ever thought possible.